Hello, and welcome to the latest Story from the Strongrooms from the Hull History Centre. Of modern origin and spurious character is just one of many comments made regarding a volume published in 1876, gloriously entitled The Sketches of Hull Celebrities, or Memoirs and Correspondence of Alderman Thomas Johnson and four lineal descendants from the year 1640 to 1858, which was to embroil local antiquarians in much debate. The publication of the Hull Celebrities came at a time when there had been an increasing interest throughout Europe in history, especially with the creation of national identities associated with the emergence of modern national states. This interest, which began in the late 18th century, continued into the 19th, was to show itself in many different aspects of society, as the past was sometimes recreated or reinterpreted for new audiences. For example, the artwork produced by the likes of Sir John Everett Millais and the literature of Sir Walter Scott. In Britain, much of this had been influenced by the revived Society of Antiquaries, and Hull was no exception, with many works on the history of the town appearing. Works by the likes of Gent, Hadley, Tickell, Frost and Sheehan were examples, although several were based on Abraham Pyme's first history of Hull, written in around 1700 but never published. It was against this background that saw the publication of the Hull Celebrities based on what became known as the Johnson Manuscript. Sometime before 1874, George Johnson, an elderly gentleman, purportedly from Great Yarmouth, wandered into the chemist and druggist shop of one William Anderson Gunnell up the corner of Walmsley Street and Leonard Street off Beverley Road in Hull. Gunnell, later described by another as somewhat illiterate, was not particularly known as an antiquarian, although his obituary in the Easter Morning News in 1885 did suggest he had dabbled. And it seems that this particular day this is just what Gunnell was doing, dabbling, or engaging in some antiquarian activity. Johnson noticed this and as a consequence offered to show Gunnell some old parchments and papers. Gunnell accepted this offer, and through a series of regular visits, Johnson loaned these papers to Gunnell, which he then copied and arranged for publication. The Easter Morning News of January the 6th, 1876, carried a letter indicating that some original, rare, amusing and valuable manuscripts relating to Hull and her public men in olden times will shortly be available. By the time of the book's publication, a few weeks later, there was perhaps already an air of expectation. When the book appeared as a stout crown octave volume of 534 pages, it listed 500 subscribers. In addition, it carried a note to the fact that a special resolution allowing Gunnell to dedicate the work to the town council had been passed on the 6th of May, 1875. What did the Hull Celebrities contain? Gunnell explained that the book was made up of the observations and reminiscences of several generations of the Johnson family, starting with Thomas Johnson in 1640, and contains matters which have never been recorded in any publication. The book starts with a description of Hull in 1640, initially with the High Street, then going on to Trinity Church, or Kirk as Johnson has it, followed by other areas of the town. It then gives biographical details of many famous and significant figures in Hull's history, mayors, merchants, MPs, benefactors and the like, or as they are known, celebrities. Perhaps Hull was ahead of its time with an interest in celebrity culture. It starts with Henry Vane the Elder and includes men like John Lyster, Andrew Marvell, William and Henry Maister and William G. Interspersed throughout are commentaries on later events and places as well, all written by the Johnson family members. There was also a pedigree with particulars of the Johnson family from 1491 to 1858, written by George Johnson, the last surviving member. Gunnell also pointed out that much is written in a quaint old Yorkshire English style, and helpfully provides us with a glossary at the back. This page for Sir John Lyster gives you a flavour of the book and its layout. However, within weeks of its publication, doubts were already creeping in. On the 17th of June, an anonymous letter appeared in the press questioning elements with the statement, "The description we confess staggers our faith in the story of the manuscript having been written in 1640, and goes on to point out why. Gunnell responded 2 days later, but the opening salvos had been fired. What was it about the Johnson manuscript that would cause such debate? Two areas can be identified. These are questions about its origins and then issues around the text itself. Gunnell never actually explained how he acquired the Johnson manuscript himself. This was left to others, and these accounts were to appear only later. The initial explanation offered in this talk was that proffered by John Symons in his 1885 book, Hull in Ye Olden Times. Symons was Hull born and bred, and initially trained as a printer before becoming involved with the family silversmith business. He became very active within local politics, eventually becoming Hull's first Jewish sheriff, and had developed an interest in local historical issues, writing articles for the local press. In 1871, he had been elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy. However, later versions of the acquisition process becoming consistent, with Gunnell either passing or posting papers back to Johnson, despite Gunnell claiming he didn't know Johnson's address either in Hull or Great Yarmouth. So who was this mysterious George Johnson? For a man from such a prominent Hull family and brought up in the town, he is not very well known. The only person who seemed to have met Johnson on more than one occasion, apart from Gunnell, was John Richardson, a man who seems closely involved with the manuscript from the start. Richardson, perhaps one of Hull's great characters, was a surgeon-dentist, town councillor and antiquarian, described at the time as a man with a goodly paunch, whose words were of his class and had amazing energy. He was very involved with the Hull Mechanics' Institute, giving many lectures as well as holding office. His obituary in the Eastern Morning News noted that he was a character who was noted for his trickery and waggery. A resident of the Charterhouse, John Booth, was apparently prepared to identify Johnson entering Gunnell's shop and passing over some papers, but was unable to offer any evidence that the individual he saw really was a George Johnson. Johnson, it appears, arrived from Great Yarmouth, made regular visits to Gunnell, left bundles of old papers, and then disappeared. How many of us would now love to be handled a pile of old manuscripts never seen before, that provides us new insights into historical events, or perhaps a plot for a historical blockbuster. Despite Symons' lecture to the Hull Mechanics' Institute in December 1876 indicating it was a valuable addition to the Annals of the town from its initial publication, most of the criticism largely focused on its alleged historical errors. It was John Roberts Boyle who was largely in the forefront of the criticism. Boyle was born in Accrington and later joined the Swedenborgian ministry as a pastor, which is what brought him and his family to Hull. As well as being a pastor, he was an author and antiquarian, and in 1889 he became a fellow of the Society of Antiquarians. Boyle identified many problems, covering areas such as the use of inappropriate language, anachronisms, issues of pedigree, conversations held by individuals after they appear to have died, and examples of plagiarism. These include, for example, a building on the High Street formerly known as the King's Head, which Hull celebrities suggested had been demolished and rebuilt a couple of times. Yet Boyle claimed that as it was still standing, any student of English domestic architecture would know it was an early 15th century building. Another example shows how in 1654 the many friends of Henry Chambers persuaded him to become a town candidate for what the manuscript does not elucidate, which is interesting as he had been dead since 1652. Furthermore, while the view from Sir John Lyster's house in around 1641 apparently includes the towers of St Mary's and the Carmelite Friary, Boyle observes this would be difficult as they wouldn't have been there at the time. Symons recognised there were some errors or perhaps a little high colouring, but did not doubt its authenticity. However, both W. W. Bean and J. J. Thorney in separate letters pointed out anachronisms and errors in the lettering results, as did Boyle, who further went on to observe that many of these results, inaccurate as they were, also appear in Sheehan's History of Hull, which had been published some years earlier. Boyle finds another example of plagiarism with a description of the White Friary ruins taken, with a few alterations, from Hargrove's History of Knaresborough, published in 1809. Boyle also wondered how Thomas Johnson, at 69, seemed to be spelling words in exactly the same way as he did at age 10, and then also considered the quaint old Yorkshire English words. Words Boyle said would be very difficult to recognise whether as quaint old Yorkshire or even English in such forms. Some examples of these words on the screen now, and I will leave you to have a go at pronouncing them. Boyle was furthermore concerned about inconsistencies between the published volume and the original manuscript, whilst he suggested it could be argued that sections omitted in the book that appear in the manuscript could be down to the need for editing. When the reverse occurs, elements appearing in the book that do not appear in the manuscript, then questions about authenticity do need to be addressed. The ensuing years saw the debate continue, with letters appearing regularly attacking and defending the Hull celebrities. Gunnell offered to provide proof of their authenticity, but never seemed to be able to do so. Over the time, the dispute became more bitter. Richardson complained that Boyle was trying to make the document appear ridiculous because a few printer's errors had crept in. Symons at one point suggested he wouldn't even blacken the end of a quill in the hope of converting Boyle to the authenticity of the Johnson manuscript. Even the deaths of Gunnell and Richardson in 1885 did not end the discussions, with many people seemingly unable to let go. In December the 19th, 1892, Boyle presented a paper to the Hull Literary Club clearly laying out his objections to the Johnson manuscript. However, this provoked a response in its defence from another local antiquarian, Joseph Temple, the very next day. Later, in January 1893, Temple again maintained that proof of its authenticity would be submitted to the British Museum or the Public Record Office for verification, but did not specify when. Boyle commented on this when his Literary Club paper was published later that same year under the title A Modern Literary Fraud, the Johnson Manuscript. Despite the errors, it is clear that the author had some understanding of Hull's history, whether it was from a family perspective as claimed by its supporters or as an antiquarian. Boyle maintained from quite an early stage that he thought the Johnson manuscript was fictional and the work of Richardson. This he illustrated by comparing elements from the manuscript with articles written by Richardson in the local press and analysing the literary style. In addition, another irrefutable piece of evidence, Boyle adds, is that Charles Edward Fewster, paintmaker and another noted local antiquarian and numismatist, who, despite being sceptical of its authorship, had 3 volumes of the Johnian manuscript in Richardson's handwriting, possibly amongst the 2,000 works on Hull in his own library. This was explained away by Temple, who said Richardson had copied out his own copy of the manuscript and then sold it to Fewster. Twice in 1884, Richardson denied being the author, and even on his deathbed, Gunnell maintained the last surviving member of the Johnson family had given him the manuscript. However, a consensus seemed to be emerging that Richardson was the author. If we accept the manuscript as genuine, then the question of why is irrelevant. However, if we accept it as a forgery, as the Easter Morning News suggested people were largely doing by 1885, then why was it written? This is always going to be a difficult question to answer. Was it a deliberate attempt to defraud contemporary antiquarians? Was it a cynical attempt to make money? Or was it a joke that went too far? A knotty problem, one that we will never perhaps really be able to answer. Personally, I think the key is that particular line in Richardson's obituary. A man known for his trickery and waggery. As I indicated earlier, the deaths of both Gunnell and Richardson in 1885 did not end the controversy. Gunnell's obituary offered us an insight into a man described as sensitive and inoffensive. It added, if Gunnell had taken steps earlier to offer proof of the authenticity of the Johnson manuscript, then perhaps he would have suffered less from the harassing attacks on unbelievers. It ends with the comment, let us think kindly of him now. Richardson, who died 6 months after Gunnell, and Temple were unrepentant in their belief in the authenticity of the manuscript. Symons, who died in 1907, towards the end of his life began to alter his view, allowing doubts to creep in. Temple's obituary to Symons adds that in his final work, Kingstonia, although he quoted from Johnson, Symons did not vouch for its accuracy. Boyle went on to become Hull Records clerk in 1895, and 1905 saw the publication of his translations of the charters and letters patent relating to Hull. However, this volume describes the author as the late clerk to the corporation. This was because that same year had seen Boyle convicted and imprisoned for stealing and pawning various letters, volumes, and artifacts. On leaving prison, he became a recluse, and according to Thomas Shepherd of Hull Museums, who wrote his obituary, refused to accept the help of friends, dying a couple of years later, a broken man. Why did so many leading figures of the day hang on to their belief in the Johnson manuscript? Perhaps we have modern parallels with Hugh Trevor Roper and the Hitler Diaries in 1983, or with the Solomon's Temple tablet in James' ossuary in Israel in 2004. There was a clear thirst for knowledge, and in the excitement of discovery, maybe sound preliminary research was one of the first casualties. With vested interests and reputations being staked so publicly, perhaps it was difficult to accept one was wrong. For example, the council had been seen to very publicly endorse the work, and Symons himself had written his own book, which had referenced the Hull celebrities. In addition, was there a Hull factor as well? Antagonism from local antiquarians? What does an outsider really know about the history of our town? Like all good myths, the story of the Hull celebrities and the Johnson manuscript refuses to die, but has entered into the canon of local history. For instance, it is mentioned in a piece by Hayton on Hull's public houses. On this occasion, though, there is at least a clear warning about the authenticity of the celebrities. However, there are many other places where the Hull celebrities can be located, in libraries, on the internet, or through antiquarian booksellers, where there is not always such a caveat. Whoever the author was, this work gave many writers the opportunity to stretch their intellectual muscles, and still challenges local historians to ask questions concerning the authenticity of documents. Thank you for listening to this brief exploration of Gunnell's Hull celebrities. and I hope you have found this talk interesting and informative. Don't forget to look out for more of our stories from the Strongrooms available each month.